It includes heavy raw opium. It includes the dried powdered flesh of venomous vipers. It includes cinnamon, myrrh, raw honey, saffron, black pepper, cardamom, and frankincense. The incredibly expensive recipe is meticulously ground into a fine paste, heavily mixed with a thick sweet syrup, and then deliberately aged in clay jars for 12 full years before it is even considered ready to consume. A single small delicate jar of Venice treacle costs more than an average London laborer earns in an entire year of backbreaking work. Wealthy households pay enormous, staggering sums for it. Panicked nobles carefully dissolve the thick paste in warm wine and drink it religiously before every single meal. Some wealthy merchants carry small, hardened amounts of it inside solid gold lockets, securely around their necks, desperately believing the fumes protect them against the corrupted air. The heavy opium easily dulls the agonizing pain of the buboes. The intense exotic spices easily mask the constant, overwhelming smell of death in the streets. But it absolutely cures nothing. And the long, complex trade routes that brought these exotic ingredients from Venice and the distant East are rapidly collapsing, because the rich merchants, the tough sailors, and the strong dock workers who carefully carried them are dying too. But here is the strangest, most ironic part of the entire medieval pharmacy. The single mundane thing that might have actually helped the population is currently being consumed by absolutely everyone, rich and poor alike, for entirely the wrong reason. It is the ale. Ale is brewed by heavily boiling water. The intense heat of the boiling process completely kills all the dangerous waterborne pathogens. The average Londoner, regardless of class, drinks an astonishing 3 pints of ale every single day. They do not do this because they magically understand the science of bacteria. The very concept of bacteria will not exist for another 500 years. They drink the ale simply because the water drawn from the Thames tastes like absolute foul mud and makes everyone violently sick. The boiling of the ale is entirely accidental life-saving medicine. And for those who cannot possibly afford the expensive theriac, or the roasted meat, or the spiced wine. For the desperate poor who continue to survive on dark bean bread and thin, watery pottage, the university doctors have one final, incredibly arrogant piece of advice. Eat strictly according to your station. The wealthy doctors proclaim that the bodies of the poor are biologically different. They state that the poor should only eat incredibly coarse, rough foods. To eat fine foods above your social class, they warn, is to disrupt your internal humors and actively invite the Black Plague directly into your body. Of absolutely everything the doctors prescribe, the sharp vinegar, the opium-laced theriac, the heavy roasted meats, the strict avoidance of fresh fruit, which one do you think actually made a difference in who lived and who died? Because what comes next is absolutely not what anyone standing in the mud of 1349 ever expected. The plague relentlessly kills half the workforce of England, and the traumatized half that miraculously survives suddenly discovers something that has never, ever happened before in English history. They have leverage. A muddy plowman who earned exactly 2 pence a day before the plague hit now confidently crosses his arms and demands 6. A tired dairymaid who was previously deeply grateful just for a warm corner to sleep in and basic board now firmly insists on being paid in hard silver coin. Exhausted workers completely refuse to show up to the fields or the workshops unless the wages suddenly match the terrifying new world they are living in, a world with exactly half as many working hands and the exact same massive amount of land requiring harvesting. On the 18th of June, 1349, while the plague is still actively killing thousands in the streets, King Edward III furiously issues the Ordinance of Laborers. This royal decree legally freezes all wages strictly at their pre-plague, 1346 levels. The stated legal penalty for a lord paying higher wages, or a peasant accepting higher wages, is immediate imprisonment. It absolutely does not work. The economic reality is too strong. Surviving peasants, flush with new illegal wages, begin aggressively eating heavy beef and roasted mutton instead of salted bacon. They demand fine white wheat bread instead of gritty barley. They buy fresh, expensive fish instead of cheap salted herring. The thick almond milk that was once the exclusive guarded luxury of the wealthy nobility suddenly becomes widely available in the common markets. Overall meat consumption dramatically rises across the entire surviving lower class. Hot, cooked food, like whole roasts and complex pasties filled with fresh fish, fowl, and wild game, becomes easily accessible to urban workers who could never have even touched it a year prior. But this massive transformation is not just economic, it is deeply cultural, and it absolutely terrifies the entrenched people in power. The poet William Langland writes about this terrifying shift in his famous work, Piers Plowman. He notes with shock that common beggars completely refuse to eat bread made with cheap beans. They aggressively demand fine white wheat bread. They flatly refuse cheap halfpenny ale, and firmly insist on drinking only the absolute best, strongest brews. They will not eat yesterday's tough bacon. They angrily demand fresh, hot flesh and freshly fried fish. A wealthy, frustrated landowner named John Gower bitterly complains in his writings. He says, "Because such a man is hired as a member of your household, he scorns all ordinary food. He grumbles constantly, and he will simply not return tomorrow unless you provide something significantly better." In 1363, a desperate parliament tries to regain control. They aggressively pass sweeping new sumptuary legislation. The law strictly dictates that mere servants shall be legally permitted to have meat or fish only once a single day. At all other times, they must consume food appropriate to their lowly estate, like milk, butter, and cheese. The simple fact that the government suddenly has to legally legislate what a peasant puts in their mouth tells you exactly what is happening. The old order is already broken. It is already too late. The peasants have tasted the roast meat and they are never going back to the bean bread. But there is one more profound thing the plague permanently changes about how humans eat. And it is the strangest, saddest psychological paradox of the entire era. The university physicians loudly proclaim, "Keep good company, drink good wine, eat good meat, avoid melancholy." Melancholy, sadness, and depression, they firmly believe, physically weaken the heart and open the body directly to the plague. The strict medical cure is to aggressively eat together, to host massive feasts, to forcefully refuse any sadness. In the desperate city of Florence, terrified people rapidly form organized dinner companies called brigate. One wealthy person hosts 10 close friends. They eat massive roasted capons, they drink heavy spiced wine, and they strictly, legally refuse to speak a single word about the dead piling up outside their doors. The very next night, someone else in the group hosts the dinner. But sometimes the guests excitedly arrive at the house, only to find no dinner prepared, because the host is already sick and bleeding in bed. Sometimes, an extravagant dinner is carefully prepared for 10 people, and only 7 quietly appear at the door. The other 3 will never appear again. In the terrified Austrian town of Neuburg, the frantic citizens officially resolve to aggressively cheer each other up with loud comfort and constant merrymaking. They desperately hope that by forcibly rekindling a sort of manic half-happiness, they can somehow keep the creeping despair from killing them faster than the plague itself. But here is the agonizing contradiction that absolutely no one in Europe can solve. While the doctors prescribe constant feasting and company, civic authorities across Europe panic and heavily ban all public gatherings. They ban the feasts. They ban the open markets. They ban the massive religious processions. In the city of Pistoia, a strict new law forcefully forbids anyone from bringing any food whatsoever to the house of a dead person. No fresh fruit, no wine, no bread. The ancient communal morning meal, the fundamental human act that had comforted grieving families for centuries, is suddenly made highly illegal. The very thing the trusted doctors prescribe for survival is the exact same thing the panicked government forbids under penalty of law. Eat together and heavily risk deadly exposure to the coughing man next to you. Eat completely alone in the dark and risk the terrible melancholy that the physicians swear will kill you. There is absolutely no safe way to eat in a plague. Which brings us directly back to the muddy streets of Cheapside. Back to the small, empty cookshop on the corner, to the completely cold stone ovens, and to the thousands of silent bones buried deep beneath them. The cookshop is closed now. The massive ovens are cold. The once deafening street of Cheapside is eerily quiet, and it will stay devastatingly quiet for an entire generation. But here is exactly what a highly specialized team of modern scientists finally found, 676 years later. In the year 2025, Modern researchers carefully analyzed the physical bones of 5,455 medieval Londoners. This massive study included the specific skeletons, pulled directly from the emergency East Smithfield Plague Cemetery. The scientists didn't look at the teeth or the shape of the skull. They meticulously measured the microscopic nitrogen isotope levels trapped inside the surviving bone collagen. In human biology, a higher nitrogen level permanently recorded in the bone means that the person consistently ate a diet incredibly rich in complex animal protein, like red meat, fresh fish, and rich dairy. A significantly lower nitrogen level indicates a poor diet, relying almost entirely on cheap grain and simple legumes. The scientific results of the massive study were absolutely not ambiguous. They were a clear, terrifying indictment of the medieval class system. The data explicitly proved that the specific people who ate significantly more protein throughout their lives had dramatically better survival odds during both the years of the Great Famine and the horrific outbreak of the Black Death. Higher nitrogen isotope values correlated absolutely directly with a significantly lower mortality risk. This stark biological relationship held completely true across every single demographic. It held across all ages, both sexes, and across every single burial site in the city. The urban poor of London, the exact same desperate laborers who lived exclusively on dark bean bread and thin pottage, the exact same people who were arrogantly told by university physicians that coarse, terrible food was medically appropriate for their lowly station, the exact same people who were strictly forbidden by brutal sumptuary laws from eating anything above their class. They died at dramatically, horrifyingly higher rates. And they did not die simply because they were physically weaker. They died because they were biologically hungrier. Their suppressed immune systems had been completely starved of the vital raw material needed to fight off a massive bacterial infection. The bubonic plague did absolutely not kill the city of London equally. It ruthlessly hunted down and killed the specific people who could not afford to eat well. The incredibly arrogant, highly paid medieval doctors were accidentally half right all along. Their expensive prescriptions of eating heavy roast meats, poultry, and good white bread actually were vastly superior to the terrible grain and water diet of the poor. But it was absolutely not because the roast meat magically balanced the body's internal humors. It was simply because complex animal protein physically builds immune resilience. And the poor of London had been severely artificially protein deficient for an entire generation before the very first infected flea ever bit a human being. This is the cruelest, most devastating irony of the entire Black Death. The strict legal sumptuary laws that forced the poor to keep eating coarse, terrible food did not just artificially enforce a social hierarchy. They literally enforced a mass death sentence. And the incredible food revolution that immediately followed the plague, the sudden aggressive consumption of beef, the mutton, the fine wheat bread, the fresh fish by the surviving peasant class, was not just a simple economic shift in wages. It was biologically the precise thing that physically kept the very next generation of humanity alive. The next time you casually open your bright refrigerator, the next time you freely choose exactly what you want to eat for dinner. When you do this without a royal law strictly telling you what your social class legally allows you to consume. Without a terrifying physician swearing to you that fresh fruit will instantly kill you. Without facing a massive price tag that puts your very survival on a shelf you cannot possibly reach. That incredible freedom, that mundane luxury you take entirely for granted passes directly through a massive muddy plague pit in East Smithfield. The people who lived through 1349 did not just passively survive the Black Plague, they aggressively, desperately ate their way right through the middle of it. They did it badly, they did it in total panic, and sometimes they did it brilliantly. And the totally transformed world that staggered out the other side of the absolute nightmare fed its surviving people entirely differently. 6 solid centuries of rigid, unbreakable human hierarchy, completely broken wide open by the microscopic gut of a single rat flea. It is a freezing Tuesday morning in February 1349. You are standing on Cheapside, the massive central market street of London. A woman steps out of a heavily slanted timber-framed doorway. She pulls her wool cloak tight against the damp chill, walks 40 paces to the cookshop on the corner, and buys a hot meat pie. It is the exact same thing she does every market day. The crust is thick and warm. The filling is heavily minced mutton. It costs her exactly 1 penny. That is half a day's wage for the man who killed the sheep. By Friday of this week, the baker who made the pie will be dead. By the following week, the cookshop will be permanently closed. The large stone ovens will be completely cold, and no one is ever coming to relight them. Because right now, across this crowded, suffocating city, 200 corpses are being buried every single day. They are being dropped into long, muddy trenches, stacked 5 bodies deep. The terrified gravediggers are running out of open ground, and the city is rapidly running out of gravediggers. Within a few short months, half of London will be gone. 35,000 people will vanish into the earth. The population of this city will not recover its numbers for another 150 years. But here is the part of the Black Death that no one ever talks about. The single thing that determined whether you lived or died during this absolute apocalypse was not the primitive medicine of the era. It was not how hard you prayed in St. Paul's Cathedral. It was not even random luck. The thing that decided your fate was sitting right there on your plate. And the absolute proof of this terrifying fact would not be found for 676 years. It was buried deep in the bones of 5,455 skeletons beneath the modern streets of this city. We are going to get to exactly what modern scientists found in those bones. But first, we need to rebuild this lost world from coroner's rolls, from the frantic plague regimens written by terrified physicians, and from the massive East Smithfield Cemetery excavation. This is exactly what people ate, while half of London disappeared around them, and why the food that the doctors promised would save them was already silently killing them. Before the plague ships ever arrive, you need to deeply understand what this medieval city eats when it is still fully alive. Stand right here on Cheapside and look around you. The streets of London are literally named for what they feed you. Bread Street sells bread. Milk Street sells milk. Poultry sells poultry. The busy fishmongers work relentlessly from the docks at Queenhithe and Billingsgate. They unload thousands of slippery silver fish from small boats capable of passing beneath the roaring arches of London Bridge. The busy cookshops lined up along Thames Street never close. Not on quiet Sundays, not even on Christmas. They sell hot pies and pasties to absolutely anyone holding a coin. The smell of London is intense and constant. It is a thick mixture of burning wood smoke, bubbling rendered animal fat, and sour ale spilling from the open doorways of hundreds of taverns. And beneath it all is the sharp metallic smell of fresh blood blowing in from Smithfield, where the city's butchers work completely in the open air, standing ankle-deep in animal offal. But you must understand this fundamental truth. Not everyone in London eats the same food. If you are a lowly peasant or a manual urban laborer hauling timber or stone, your diet is overwhelmingly bread, and it is not the fine, soft wheat bread you know today. It is heavy, dark bean bread or mixed grain that feels like grit in your teeth. You survive on pottage, a thin, watery oatmeal gruel boiled for hours. You drink weak, thin ale. If you are incredibly fortunate, you might get a single tough strip of heavily salted bacon once a week. Fresh meat is exclusively for the wealthy. And this isn't just a matter of price, it is the law. Strict sumptuary laws heavily enforce the social divide. You eat exactly what your designated social class permits you to eat. Nothing more. The wealthy nobility and the rich merchants eat in an entirely different universe. They consume heavily spiced, imported wine. They eat whole roasted venison. They drink almond milk heavily thickened with imported rice. They consume raw sugar imported at great risk from the distant Mediterranean, at a price that would take a common laborer 120 uninterrupted days to earn just to buy a single pound. Their massive kitchens have roaring stone hearths. Yours does not. And there is a dark secret hanging over this entire population. This city has already been starving for decades. The Great Famine struck England brutally from 1315 to 1322. 7 long years of completely drowned, rotting harvests and empty grain silos. And immediately following the famine, the great bovine pestilence swept through the fields. It violently killed 62% of all of England's cattle. Fresh dairy practically vanished from the English diet for over a decade. The people standing shoulder to shoulder in Cheapside in 1349 are the direct children and grandchildren of those desperate famine survivors. They are chronically short of complex protein. They are short of calcium. They are completely depleted of vitamin B12. They are already biologically damaged, weakened from the inside out, long before the very first plague ship ever docked at the southern ports. This is the fragile, hungry city that somehow feeds 70,000 people every single day. And then, in the damp, freezing fog of November 1348, the very first infected rat arrives off a boat from the continent. The plague does not choose its victims. It does not negotiate. It effortlessly kills the sweating baker and the wealthy bishop living on the exact same street in the exact same week. The bakers die at their ovens. The brewers die over their vats. The blood-soaked butchers at Smithfield collapse in the mud. The shouting fishmongers at Billingsgate fall silent. The desperate men who drive the heavy wooden grain carts from the countryside die on the muddy roads, long before the vital grain ever reaches the city walls. The vast fields outside London go completely unharvested, not because the crops failed this year, but because the calloused hands that would have cut them are currently being unceremoniously dumped into a massive trench at East Smithfield. Between Candlemas and Easter, from February to April of 1349, more than 200 completely rigid bodies are carried to the newly consecrated burial ground every single day. When archaeologists carefully excavated this specific site in the 1980s, they found something buried in the dirt that tells the entire terrifying story of the collapse. The very early graves, dug in February, are neat and orderly. The bodies are laid respectfully in perfectly straight rows, carefully aligned east to west, according to religious custom. But the later graves, dug just weeks later in April, are not. The bodies in the upper layers are simply thrown in at random angles, tangled together in a chaotic panic. The fragile system of the city broke much faster than the soft ground could hold them. King Edward III sits in safety and writes a furious, terrified letter to the struggling mayor of London. The streets, the king writes, are completely foul with human feces. The air of the city is dangerously poisoned, making it incredibly dangerous in this time of infectious disease. Heavy wooden dead carts begin to roll violently through the narrow, crooked lanes at dawn. The desperate cries of the cart drivers echo off the timber walls. Surviving families are too terrified to carry their own dead outside. Instead, they slowly lower the infected bodies of their children and spouses from upper-story windows, using long wooden poles with iron hooks attached to the end, because they know that touching the dead means inevitably joining them. And yet, incredibly, the open-air food markets located right next to these massive, overflowing mass graves keep operating, because the desperate people who are still breathing have absolutely nowhere else to buy what little food remains in the city. Look closely at what is actually happening here. The complex supply chain of the capital is not merely disrupted, it is entirely gone. The specialized people who grew the wheat, who transported the sacks, who slaughtered the sheep, who baked the loaves, and who sold every single piece of food in this massive city, are dying at the exact same terrifying rate as the people they fed. But the people still desperately need to eat. And what the highly educated, wealthy doctors tell them to eat next will inadvertently make absolutely everything worse. The university-trained physicians of 1349 firmly believe that the plague is caused by corrupted air. A foul, poisonous miasma that enters the human body through the pores and violently disrupts the four vital humors. According to their thick medical texts, the body most vulnerable to catching the plague is one that is internally hot and moist. Therefore, the strict medical cure is to aggressively eat foods that are internally cold and dry. This means you must completely avoid all fresh fruit. You must avoid all root vegetables. You must avoid all fresh dairy. You must completely avoid fish. The doctors confidently proclaim that these specific foods are highly dangerous, that they will force the pores of your skin open, directly inviting the deadly pestilence into your blood. Instead, the physicians command you to eat heavily roasted meats, eat poultry, eat good, dense wheat bread, consume heavy spices, and above absolutely all else, consume sharp vinegar. Vinegar suddenly appears in absolutely every single published plague regimen for the next 3 centuries. Terrified Europeans vigorously add it to all their sauces. They eagerly sprinkle it through the dark corners of their houses. They aggressively rub it into their skin. They soak thick woolen cloths in it, and press them tightly against their faces when they walk the streets. A famous, heavily guarded recipe called 4 Thieves Vinegar heavily mixes it with raw garlic, strong herbs, and exotic spices. Panicked doctors hold thick slices of vinegar-soaked bread directly in front of their noses when treating the dying, using the bread as a primitive, useless mask against what they falsely call infected air. But the medical advice is not even consistent. It is a chaotic mess of guessing. One respected physician confidently recommends eating large amounts of lettuce. The prestigious medical faculty at the University of Paris formally forbids eating lettuce entirely. A published regimen originating from Prague strictly prescribes eating figs and filberts. A rival regimen from Montpellier says you must absolutely avoid all nuts entirely. Nobody in the medical community agrees on anything. Except for this one fatal, universally accepted fact: the air is poisoned, and eating the right food can magically protect you from it. Stay with this specific medical advice for a moment. Think about it carefully. Read the strict doctor's regimen back in your mind. Not a single thing in it, not one single piece of advice, has absolutely anything to do with how the bubonic plague actually spreads. The bubonic plague is not carried by foul air. It is carried by the microscopic gut bacteria of fleas. The fleas live in the fur of black rats, and the rats live deep inside the massive grain stores of the city. The exact same grain that makes the very wheat bread these doctors are aggressively prescribing as a cure. Every single time a terrified baker reaches deep into the dark grain bin to make the medicine the doctors ordered, he is reaching directly into the exact dark place where the plague actually lives. But there is one specific, incredibly rare medical remedy that costs more than everything else combined. And it contains something that would be highly illegal in almost most countries today. It is called theriac. The absolute finest, most expensive version is known as Venice treacle. It is a complex, closely guarded recipe containing between 60 and 80 different ingredients.